Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm David Bird with Reality Reimagined. I'm an award-winning photographer and Photoshop artist that specializes in fantasy composite art. And today I want to take a look at a new plugin for Adobe Photoshop that is called Infinite Unify. And it is essentially a very easy to use interface that helps you color balance skin tones in any image. Infinite Unify is a part of the Infinite Tools lineup of software for Photoshop. The most notable and famous of these is Infinite Color, which is a color grading plugin for Photoshop that is truly infinite in all the options that it offers to you. I've been testing Infinite Unify for the past couple of days. I really like what I see. It's incredibly efficient and offers you some really great options of solving the most basic issues that you would find in skin tones in any image. So let's dive into Photoshop, take a look at 3 different examples today, and put these images through their paces with Infinite Unify. To get started, let's talk about why we would want to color balance skin tones in an image. In previous videos, I've said that everybody on Earth, regardless of your ethnicity, you have the color orange and yellow in your skin tone. So you would think if I take a photograph of somebody, anywhere where I see their skin, there should be plenty of orange and yellow. I don't need to balance anything. That's actually very rarely the case. There are so many factors that come into play that can affect the availability of orange and yellow in the skin, or factors that can completely change the orange and yellow to a completely different color. Things like color contamination that comes in from the clothing that they're wearing or the background. If you're photographing a person in a studio in a lighting controlled environment, parts of their body that were not properly exposed by the lights, you're going to have a completely different skin tone there than in the parts of the body that were properly exposed. So things like blood flow, their skin is cold or hot, they have a sunburn. We need a tool to be able to introduce orange and yellow into those areas where those colors are not prevalent in the skin and be able to balance it with the orange and yellow that is there, that we can see in the skin. And that's where Infinite Unify comes into play. Now, Infinite Unify uses a very simple tool inside of Photoshop to be able to do this. And this tool does all the heavy lifting. And it's a gradient map adjustment layer, one of the most basic tools inside of Photoshop. What is a gradient map? Essentially, it's a way for you to map out colors that represent a transition between shadow to highlight. So you can pick any amount of colors you want and say, I want you to transition from this color to this one, and everything in between will be those transitions. When it comes into skin tones, we're going to choose a color of skin that is the darkest part of the skin, a color that is the brightest part of the skin, and a color in between. Luminosity values, highlight, shadow, and midtone. Darkest part of the skin, brightest part of the skin, the midtones in between them. And we can choose more than just those. We can choose up to 5 using Infinite Unify, so that the more colors in between, the smoother of transition, the more realistic of skin color. This technique of a gradient map, I actually have been using this for a long time because it's a technique I learned from Pratik Nayak, who's arguably one of the world's greatest retouchers. He's a photographer and he's a wonderful human being. He's also one of the creators of Infinite Unify and the author Infinite Tools. I learned this a long time ago and I use it all the time, and now it's built into this panel, but this panel gives you so many other options that truly creates efficiency and makes it easy for you to do this process. So let's look at the Infinite Unify panel. There are 3 ways to make this gradient map. We're going to look at the first 2 with these images. We'll look at the third way to make the gradient map with the final image that we'll look at in today's tutorial. So the easiest way first to make a gradient map is simply to hit the word create. And then Skynet's going to look at the image and try to figure out what it thinks a skin tone is, and then make the gradient map. Once it was done, it produced the gradient map adjustment layer. It put a black mask onto it so it hid the entire effect. It changed the blending mode to color, and it reduced the opacity by default to 60%. So we would start painting white onto this layer mask to reveal it. But where do we need to paint that in? Well, we need to look at the image and decipher where is yellow missing in this scene. So I'm going to click the background layer and go into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter so that we can get access to the color orange in the color mixer. And I'm simply going to increase the overall saturation until it looks like an Oompa Loompa hellscape and then zoom in just a little bit, not that much. Let's back out. So as we can see immediately right now, her forearm doesn't have a lot of orange in it. Little bits and pieces of her forehead, some of her face, her tummy, it's missing through here, but we can see it over here on this side. Does this mean that Janelle doesn't have orange and yellow in her skin tones in those sections? No, it's color contamination that's coming in from the sky and other factors. So that's where the gradient map comes into play. When I made it this way by just simply hitting create, again, Photoshop looked at all the available colors and said, these are skin tones. There's your gradient map here on the interface. I said select 5 colors. These are the 5 colors that it shows. So we see the darkest color of skin tone, the brightest, and these three in between. These samples are showing you the actual transitions between them. The smoothness slider is how we can set those transitions to be a little bit more graceful. By default, it's set to 50. If we take it to 0, the transition is going to be really harsh. Set it to 100, it's going to be the smoothest as possible. In the training videos that are available on the website, Pratik talks about how the default set to 50 is generally the best way to go. So this first option of creating the gradient map is not actually the best way for this image. Why? Because again, Photoshop looked for those skin tones. Well, there's certainly yellow and orange in her skin. There's also yellow and orange in the background itself. And that's why we have all these varying colors that we see in the samples here. So what we need to do is to tell Photoshop and to tell Infinite Unify, select only a targeted area of skin to draw those colors from for the gradient map itself. So to do that, I'm going to delete this gradient map that it created, and I'm going to hit L for the lasso tool. And I'm going to zoom into the image and make a selection that I will tell Infinite Unify to draw from. Now, I want to be careful while I select this because ultimately I need skin tones that represent highlight, shadow, and midtone, but I don't want to select areas like her cheek because that could have makeup in it that could affect it. And I don't want to select areas like up here because her forearm doesn't have yellow and orange in it, so we're going to get a different result. So when we looked at the image in Adobe Camera Raw, one of the areas of her body that was completely filled with orange was her bicep here on her right arm. And as we zoom in, we can kind of do a little detective work with our eyes to see there is a darker skin tone here, there's some midtones, and there's a little bit of a highlight. So while the background layer is selected on the lasso tool, I'm simply just going to make a rough selection. It doesn't have to be super big and accurate and precise, but anything inside of it is going to be used for that gradient map. Once that selection is active, I'm going to hit create again, and then Infinite Unify, Photoshop are going to use just that selection to make those colors. And now we can see the samples are vastly different from the first one. Here are the colors in the gradient map that are actually coming into play. So now I simply want to start painting on this layer mask that is black. I'm going to paint white on it to start revealing this gradient map. But I need to paint it in areas where those colors are not prevalent. I don't want to paint it in areas where the colors are prevalent or things like her hair or her dress or the background. Because keep in mind, this adjustment layer is a gateway that tells Photoshop what can be done to the layers beneath it. So this gradient map is telling Photoshop, you can only use these colors. So anywhere where you reveal this layer mask, only these colors will come into play. So it would change the dress to be these colors or the background. And if I start painting on sections of the skin that already have a lot of orange and yellow, because the opacity of this layer is set to 60%, that means 40% of this original layer is visible. So that places where there's already orange and yellow, if I start adding more orange and yellow because of this gradient map, it's going to double it and make it look really bad. It's going to make it look like certain sections of her skin are bright orange Oompa Loompish, and we don't want that in the image. So we need to be able to see where it's missing. So I'm going to make a hue saturation adjustment layer, and I'm going to change from master here to yellow and increase the saturation so we get that Oompa Loompa look again. And we can use this as a guide to start painting on this layer mask to reveal the gradient map in those areas where orange and yellow are not prevalent. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit, and I'm going to paint with a flow of 10% on my basic brush because subtlety is key inside of Photoshop. So I'm going to start painting, and we can see a little bit of the effect taking place even with that hue saturation adjustment layer that's on. Let me make sure that I'm on my soft round brush. Good. And I'm using a soft round brush, and I recommend that you use a soft brush and not a hard one. Okay, and we'll keep painting through here. And keep in mind that hue saturation adjustment layer is helping us see some of those changes, but don't get discouraged if you don't see like massive changes right away. And I'm painting outside the line right now. I do recommend that you be much more careful, but for purposes of the video, I'm trying to hurry so we don't spend half an hour on this saga of today's tutorial. Hit Control or Command on the number 0 to zoom all the way back out. Let's turn off the hue saturation adjustment layer. Now let's zoom back in just a little bit. Here is the after. Let's look at her forearm. Here's the after. Here's the before. Before, after. I mean, after, before. It's been a long day. What do you want from me? It's changing it. And keep in mind, it's subtle because we painted with a flow of 10%. If you need to see more of it, paint with a heavier brush or increase the opacity of a layer from 60% to like 80 or 100. It just depends. It's circumstantial based upon every single image. But that's how basically this works, being able to color balance the scene itself. Let's look at the separate example here and go into the ways of how we could use this beyond just skin tones. So as we look at this image, let's take it into Adobe Camera Raw real quick, and we'll go into the orange slider and increase the overall saturation. In this case, there's pretty much orange everywhere in her skin. There's only just a few areas where it's missing, but they're so minor that yes, we can use Infinite Unify to create the gradient map and paint those in, but ultimately I don't think it's that necessary. But there is one place where we can definitely use it, and it isn't her skin, it's her hair. If we look at her hair's got a lot of vibrant color here on this side that was facing the setting sun. The sun was setting off of camera left. But if we look over here, the colors are not as vibrant. There's not that much there. It's because it's color contamination coming in from the sky. We just don't have it. It's not being illuminated by a bright orange light source. So we can use Infinite Unify to take care of that. So again, I'm going to go to the lasso tool. I'm going to make a selection of the hair that represents some of the shadows, highlights, and the midtones, and then hit create. It's going to make the gradient map based upon all of that. You can see the colors that it shows here, darkest to lightest, the transition in between them. And then I'm going to come to the layer mask itself, hit B for brush, change my flow to 10%. Let's go 5%, because again, subtlety is key inside of Photoshop, and just simply start painting it in on this side of her hair. Keep in mind, it's a gradient map, so it's only allowing those colors to exist. So I only want to stay in the hair because I just chose colors that represent her hair. If I start painting it onto her dress or even her skin, it's going to start changing her skin to be these colors. And I want to be careful of how far I go with that. But now let's take a look at the before and after. After, before. Look at how much more rich and warm her hair looks by using this gradient map, by using Infinite Unify. Let's go all the way out and just take a global assessment of it. It makes such a significant difference. And it's so easy to do because, again, Infinite Unify's algorithm is selecting those colors based upon your selection with the lasso tool. Let's look at the third image example and the third way that we can create a gradient map using Infinite Unify. This image was photographed in the studio, and it reflects the dramatic lighting that I like to use all the time. And this is a constant problem for me because I'm using one big main light, and I like butterfly lighting where the light is positioned above the model and tilted down. So in this case, her right hand is not properly illuminated. So therefore, the skin tones in that hand are vastly different from her chest and her face. Arguably, her left hand has different skin tones than this one or her chest and her face. And that's where Infinite Unify will come into play with that gradient map. But the third way to create this is to open up a dialog in Photoshop where we can set the colors and choose how intense they are as the sample for the gradient map. To do that, we need to activate this icon in the Infinite Unify panel. When I click this, it says Open Dialog. So now with that activated, when I click Create, it's going to open up the color range option. This is built into Photoshop. This isn't a special thing that comes with Infinite Unify. So as we can see here, it's set right now to look for colors and the range between them. We've set the selection to be skin tones. And here the fuzziness slider, which I think is always so funny, it's called fuzziness. Ultimately, anything we see in white is what Photoshop thinks is a skin tone. Anything that's in black, any colors found there, it's not going to select those. So as we increase the fuzziness slider, it's going to continually find more colors in that range. Or as we decrease the fuzziness slider all the way down to 0, now it's black, it's found no color whatsoever. If we take it to 1, or not 12, but 1, it's finding some of those skin tones. We have those odd little patterns because it's looking for more of those colors. We're increasing the range of what it's finding. So let's take it back to like 70 is fine, 71. So we can see most of her face, most of her chest. We can even see her hands. Because keep in mind, even though those skin tones in her hand are different from her chest, they still fall in the realm of skin tones of yellow, orange, and so forth. But one thing I want you to pay attention to in this view, and we'll explain it in just a moment, is notice how on the shadow side of her face, it's found nothing. Because it's the shadow side of her face. The flash did not illuminate that section. That'll come into play here in just a moment. So with this color range chosen, we're essentially using this option to be able to control how far the algorithm is going to find those colors in the scene. Once we've found a good overall selection, I'm going to hit OK, and then Infinite Unify will do its job and create the gradient map based upon those skin tones that we just manually chose. Now again, we could use the lasso tool to do that, but we have to find somewhere in the image that represents good skin tones of highlight, shadow, and midtone. If we use color range, essentially Photoshop is going to look for all the colors in a certain range based upon our selection with that dialog itself. Now we have all the colors here. So first, let's come down to her hand, and we'll paint 10% flow, painting white to reveal it. Now it's very minimal because we're painting at 10% flow. So let me increase to 100% flow just for the purposes of the video so you can see. As I continue to paint, and I just went outside the lines, you can see it's changing the colors of her jeans, the background, and her hands to match those colors that it found everywhere else in the image. If I come down to this image, I can do the same, or this hand, excuse me, I can do the same thing. Painting with a flow of 10%, I'm just warming up some of those different colors that we see there. They weren't as strong in this hand as they will be up here on her face. So that's one way to use this, but the reason why I point out those shadows is there is no color there comparatively to all the other colors that we see. So I'm going to change the flow of my brush to 5% because this definitely needs to be subtlety, as key is Photoshop. So I'm going to start painting white into the shadow very minimally, and I'm warming up the shadows using the existing colors found in her skin, found in this image. So it's not going to create a visual disparagement to our eyes because these are colors that are already there, but we're warming up the shadows just a touch. So when we look at it from this perspective, here is the after, look at the shadows in her jaw, and before. Zoom in just a little bit more. It's such a minor little step, but it's minor steps like this. Whether you're adding colors to the shadows or adding orange and yellow to sections of the skin where it isn't there, unifying it with everything else, it's those subtle little steps that when you build them up, it makes great artwork. The last couple of things I want to point out are just some of these other controls at the bottom right now. This is an option for blending modes. So the basic default blending mode is to change the blending mode to color, which is what we've seen in all these examples. There are two other options of blending modes that will help you with these gradient maps, but arguably they're not going to be that prevalent. The situation where you need to use those are going to be very random. So most of the time you will use color. The other options are hue and saturation, and you're going to have differing results based upon those blending modes. So if you're using the color blending mode and you're working with this and it's just not quite hitting the mark, try those other blending modes. Another option for you is to do a blend if, where you're going to tell Photoshop to let the base layer, highlights and shadows come up and through. So it's going to try to balance this gradient map with the base image below it using the blend if where highlights and shadows can come through. The open dialog box, we've already checked that. With this box checked, it's essentially the mask option. When it's checked, it means it will make the black mask onto the gradient map, which means that the gradient map, we do not see its effects until we paint white onto it. When that's not checked, you will simply have a white mask or a reveal all, or we'll see the entire effect. And the last option is just a preview, and all this does is turn off the actual layer mask itself on and off so you can see the overall effect. If we were to have a white mask, this is how it would look when we make the gradient map itself. So that's why I choose to leave this layer mask option turned on. So every single gradient map will always have a black mask to it. I prefer the color blending mode for the layer itself, and I have not found a reason to use blend if yet, but I am sure there will come a time for it when it's needed. So that's the overview of Infinite Unify. Let's have some final thoughts and finish up this video for today. First, I want to say that I am not sponsored by Infinite Tools. Pratik did not ask me to make this video. I get no financial compensation whatsoever for it. I simply want to push out the information to all of you. I bought the panel, I tested it and used it, and I like using it. But I want to be honest with you in software reviews and tech and so forth when it relates to photography and Photoshop. If you know it's a gradient map, then why buy the panel? And the answer is simple. It creates efficiency for you. The process of going in and selecting the colors, selecting the opacity falloffs and variances to it, and doing that more than once, because you can use this technique, not just on the skin, but to do the hair, the clothing, the background, all kinds of issues. The possibilities are endless. And the panel drives Photoshop for you. All you have to do is literally hit a button. That saves you so much time. There are so many times when I'm doing a retouch where I'm like, oh God, I don't want to go through and pick out the colors. I'm just being lazy. I'll just paint something during frequency separation. Now I can hit a button and Photoshop will find the colors that are accurate, and it saves so much time. At the time of this recording, it's September 7th, 2020 at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Infinite Unify was on sale as 30% off as a part of a summer initiative. So if you go to the description below, there's a link to the Infinite Tools website. It's not an affiliate link. I don't get any kind of compensation for it. But on the website are other tutorial examples showing you how to use this tool. For me, especially with it being on sale, it was well worth the purchase. It's going to save me a lot of time in the retouch. So I highly recommend go to the website, check out more information about it, and make a decision for yourself. Thanks for watching this video. If you like the content that you found in it, make sure to give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel because new content debuts each week in photography and Photoshop education. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of that new content when you return to the YouTubes. Thanks again, and until next time, I'll see you out there in the world of Photoshop.